Well, good afternoon, everybody. This promises to be a very exciting episode as we have Dan Hughes, who is the founder of Alpha Property Insights, joining us to talk about all things technology. And just before I bring him on, I want to give a little bit of a preface on the variety of different guests that Wyatt, my podcast producer, and I reach out to try and get on this show. I really want to have a wide scope of experts and topics related to the industrial real estate industry, but really just to round out the full picture. Whether you're an investor, a developer, owner, a broker, involved in industrial real estate in any manner, I really want to tell a full story on all the different facets of the industry. And that involves sometimes diving into the weeds with specifically related to brokers or investors. But I also think technology is something that we all need to be aware of. And I put a post on LinkedIn earlier today about how I was born in 1980. So that kind of puts me right on the cusp of being a Gen Xer and a millennial. And how I would describe my journey through going through school and university and now working in the industry is I didn't grow up with internet in school. That wasn't common, but I felt that I was able to implement it fairly easily without too much sensory overload. But now we're getting into this Web 3.0, and I can relate to some of the people who have said that technology is coming at them so fast that it's hard to stay on top of things. It can seem overwhelming. I can relate to that because this Web 3.0 with blockchain and Metaverse and all the different things that are coming at us, it does seem overwhelming to me. So I bring guests on like Dan to help tell that story. And if for no other reason than I'm really curious about this. So I hope that you're curious to learn some of this stuff as well. Completely live interview. So if you want to join in and ask any questions related to technology, either in itself or as it relates to the industry, please feel free to join in on the chat. And if you're watching this after, please leave a comment as well. And if I can answer it or if I can get an answer for it, I'll do my best to answer any other questions that come in, whether it's live or after. But with that long-winded introduction, I am pleased to join in Dan, who joins us from England. Dan, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Chad, thank you very much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, so you said that you just came from the gym, and it's 7 o'clock for you right now, so it's you're already starting to wind into the evening.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's the end of the day, but all good, and it's really good to be here. So thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for so much for joining me. We had a few people join in. I just want to say hi to you real quick. Yakov joined in. Beverly, hi to both of you. And again, please feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Oh, LG as well. Looking forward to the call. Such a fascinating topic. I agree. This is a very fascinating topic. And it's one that I want to dive into. And I think that there's a question that came in earlier, which tees up this conversation quite neatly. And I don't want to hit Dan with a tough question right off the beginning. So I asked him if he was okay with this, and he said he is. From Warehouse Investor, so I think we get a sense of what type of viewer this is. Do investors need to know about the metaverse, or is it a fad? And Dan, I'll give you full leeway on how you want to answer this. If you want to perhaps give a high-level overview of what the metaverse is, and then whether it is relevant to people in the industrial real estate space, and if it's something that they'll be aware of. But anywhere you want to take that conversation, I might ask some follow-up questions as you go, but feel free to answer it however you like.
Sure. So it's a great question to start with. So we'll get straight into it. So I guess the question is sort of yes and sort of no is the answer, which is not massively helpful. So let me get into a bit more detail. I think it depends what you mean by the metaverse, and it depends over what sort of time frame you're talking about, and it depends what you need to know about it. So I firmly believe that the future is going to be a combination of people and technology working together, and there will be a combination of different specialists. Some will be technology experts, some will be people and building and property experts, and some people will sit in between. And it'll be a huge team of people who make anything happen, whether it's an investment into industrial or whether it's anything else in the property market. So I think in the future, there's going to be this huge drive and a huge team of complex elements. And I think that everyone involved with it will have to have a very high level understanding of what's happening. But they're not going to know the details of it and understand it intricately. So if you're an investor, I don't think you need to have a detailed understanding of the metaverse and how it works and be able to code and program and do things. I do think it's important to know what it is and where it is and how it might be used. And to use an analogy, then something like a computer. So we all, obviously, we're talking on a computer. We all use them all the time at work. If you go to most people in property, then they use a computer for most things, or a mobile phone. Very few know how to build a computer, or how to code, or how to design a microchip. So I think the important thing is for all property professionals to understand what the computer is and what it allows you to do, but not necessarily how to design it. And I'd say that's true for the metaverse and pretty much everything else as well. So I think it's really important to understand very high level what it is and the implications, but not necessarily anything more detailed about that, because there are specialists who can do that. So that brings us on to the question of what is the metaverse and how is it going to affect property longer term. And that's perhaps a conversation that we can go and dig into a little bit further. But I think at a very high level, I think it's very easy to get caught up on some of these different buzzwords about what's out there. And for me, it's all about having a virtual world that people operate and engage in. And we've already started seeing signs and starting points of that. So in terms of gaming, for example, younger generations in particular, but all people spend an awful lot of time, or people from all generations, sorry, spend a lot of time on games in virtual worlds and socialize. And I think COVID has really accelerated that. I think when we get into the Web.3 element, it becomes a little bit more about ownership. So someone explained the web to me really nicely, I think, a few years ago, where they said Web 1.0 is all about centralized content where people go in and read it. Web 2.0, which arguably is where we are at the moment, is all about centralized content, but people read it, and also that's about creation. So we've seen the rise of social media, creating content, blogs, and so on. And Web 3.0 is really about it being decentralized. So it's not the dominance of individual companies. And it's also about reading, it's about creating, but it's also about owning. And so I think where we are between those virtual worlds getting to what most people would refer to as the metaverse is that sort of ownership and that real digital world that people spend their times in, as opposed to dipping in and out of games or platforms. So I think that's what the metaverse is. I think where it is going in the future really depends on how much it affects the property sector. Depends on what sort of time frame you're talking about. So if you're talking about the next couple of weeks, probably not a whole heap. If you're talking about the next 50 years, then probably quite a lot. And I think it's important for us to really understand what those changes are over time. And I think identifying what some of those trends are is quite easy. What's harder is working out whether they are going to be in 5 years or they are going to be in 50 years. And I think that some of the lessons that we can take from it are, even if we're not quite sure what it's going to do and where it's going to be, we have seen this before with things like the internet coming up, where there were brilliant quotes about no one would ever buy a book online. Look at where Amazon are now. And just those, it's really easy in hindsight to look back and laugh at those. But just because it doesn't feel like something that you or I might want to jump into doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of people who will want to. And those people are going to be coming through in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And they are the customers and the employees of our businesses, the businesses that use industrial warehouse, the businesses that operate with it. So I think it's a long answer to a simple question. But do investors need to know about it? Yes, absolutely, but certainly not in any depth, in my view. And is it a fad? I don't think so, but I think there's a lot of talk about it being a little bit more than it is at the moment and happening a little bit faster.
Yeah, that was so very well said. I love the number of points you made in there, especially breaking down Web 1.0 all the way to Web 3.0. And I agree completely with that last point that you made, that it might not be something that I myself am particularly interested in, with this metaverse, with these VR goggles and living in an augmented reality. That might not be something that I will do in the near future. But the next generation of people coming up that grew up with this technology, that are a lot more comfortable with it than you or I might be, they will adopt this. And I think that there'll also be people that are the older generation that will also see some appeal with this. So I really like the point that you made, that there will be customers for it. So whether or not we agree with it, or whether someone has a contrarian opinion, this is coming. This is the next iteration of the internet. So I guess I have a number of questions I want to ask you on this, because I find the whole thing quite fascinating, and I do want to stay on top of it, if for no other reason then I might not use it, but I recognize that other people will. So I want to dive into a few things. So I actually, and I'm going to see if I can put this link in here, because I found this fascinating. I did read that article that you put in there as well, about some of the comments that were in there about nobody's going to buy books online, and here we are now. It's quite popular. Wyatt, if you can put that link that I just put into the chat bar. So it was basically a link that came out. A large commercial brokerage was hired to by Decentraland, or a developer within Decentraland, to be the exclusive leasing agent for a meta mall, 121,000 square feet of digital retail space. So that's something that I find really fascinating from the commercial real estate, or even just more broadly the real estate landscape. How will and I think you preface this very nicely by saying the metaverse is actually quite broad. There's a lot of different buzzwords, and it can mean different things to different people. But in this Decentraland, or some of these other online metaverse platforms, and I probably sound like a boomer even how I just said that, but in these platforms, what is the application for real estate?
So I mean, again, it's a great question. Let's sort of unpack it a little bit into a few different bits. So let's start off with the metaverse. So we've gone into a little bit about what it is. It is let's call it a virtual world that people go into to live their lives, and that doesn't necessarily have to be virtual reality, but let's just say it's that virtual world. And I think that's oversimplifying it. But for the purpose of this conversation, for now, if we say that it is, I think that we're talking about real estate in a virtual world. That isn't by definition an oxymoron. I mean, the attributes of real estate is by definition, you can feel it, you can touch it, you can't recreate it. There is no more land to be got until we can make it to Mars or wherever it might be. So the real estate market is driven fundamentally by the fact that there is a finite amount of space on the planet. Buildings can't move. If you're in the middle of New York City, or in the middle of Toronto, or you're in the middle of Paris, you're in the middle of Paris or New York or Toronto. If you're in the outside, you're in the outside, and you don't get so many people going there. And that fundamentally drives the businesses. Now, what we're not quite sure about is when you get into this virtual world, is that true? Certainly, it's not true that you can't create more space, because you can create that forever. What is possible is that you get people going to specific places within that virtual world, and then they will interact with it. So a shopping mall, for example, is a great example. And so there are some rules of real estate that we live and die by that are absolute truths that in the metaverse just won't exist. So land is not a finite resource. There are other things, which is if you go somewhere where everyone else is, like a traditional real mall, then in the virtual world it's exactly the same. So I think there's a really interesting debate, and I have a view, but I'm not entirely sure where this is going to go. I'm not sure anyone knows where it'll go, because if you're buying land in a platform that's a virtual world, it isn't a finite resource. And how do you pick which platform? There is only one planet. If you're in one city, you're in one city. But how do you choose the right planet? How do you choose the right platform? And I think the theory is that over time, these platforms merge. So you can go between them a lot more. But it isn't the same rules that we run everything by in real estate. And so the value of property, the leasing of it, the attractiveness of real estate is driven by the fact it's a unique asset. You can feel it, touch it. If you look at it as an investment class, then people like investing in real estate because you can see it. If you invest in something on the online world, then by definition, it is zeros and ones that are sitting somewhere in a data center. So I think there are some real similarities, some real differences. What I think would be really interesting is if you look at that, it's then very easy to be cynical about a shopping mall in Decentraland or something else. But the fact of the matter is, people will go there in this world. If you look at games on Fortnite, for example, has hosted a lot of live concerts on Fortnite, and they've attracted huge numbers of people. Many more that could go to a normal world. And so that is a physical space in a virtual world, accepting that that's an oxymoron, that people are really being attracted to and they can make money from. So I think what's going to be really interesting in how those two worlds come together, the real estate world and how it operates, is based on rules that don't exist in the metaverse or online. But at the same time, many of the basic principles are absolutely applicable in that space. And how as a sector we go forward, either saying we only do with physical assets, or do we apply those lessons that we've learned and apply them to the metaverse, I think is going to be a really interesting challenge.
Yeah, very interesting. And why I just put on the article there too. If you can put that into the to the chat function too, why that'd be really helpful. Yeah, just really interesting that this is starting to get the attention of large companies that are there's a leasing agent that's being hired to lease out this space now, which I find absolutely fascinating. And I've heard comments from people saying that they're never going to go into the metaverse, they're never going to be in this VR or augmented reality world. But I think that there's an argument to be made that to some extent we already are in this world. Just instead of having VR glasses on, we're tethered to a screen or tethered to a phone. So it's not as big of a leap as some people might think, going from all the screen time that we're all subjected to on a regular basis to now having VR glasses.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's really important. So I don't buy into some of the classifications of different generations being completely different all the time. But there's no question that someone who is 20 versus someone who is 80 just has a very different upbringing with technology and how comfortable they are with it. And if you look at some of the younger generation, they are brought up with interacting with people online. So I
Mhm.
think the iPad itself was launched in 2011, really not that long ago. And if you look at that sort of time frame of when those things were launched, the iPhone was 2007, I think. So, it's not long ago. It really isn't long ago since these things were done. And from our society at every generation level, we're now tethered, as you say, to the mobile phone or to the tablet or to whatever it might be. And if you look at things like Fortnite, picking on that as a game, which is a gaming platform, not the metaverse, so I'm slightly bringing those two things together. But I think that there's a lot of similarity there. Certainly, that people who use Fortnite are having interactions in there to watch concerts, to see friends, to play games, to communicate with people. It was a real outlet for an awful lot of the younger generation during COVID when they were locked down and didn't have a social life. And at the beginning of 2001, Fortnite had over 400 million users. That's a
Wow.
lot of people who are using it. Now, granted, that's not the whole population of the world by any stretch. That's a long way to go, and it doesn't mean that everyone is going to be using it. But I think if you say people who want to go and have a social life and listen to a concert in the virtual world isn't going to exist, then there's really good concrete proof that that's not true, and they do exist. They are out there. And so the places that we have to build for people in the future have to be both considerate of that and also the physical space.
So I apologize for perhaps sounding very naive on this, but I guess it's worth differentiating between metaverse and VR, because I think that even I was prone to this, that you hear metaverse and you just think somebody wearing virtual reality goggles. Are they the same, or is there just like a Venn diagram where there's some overlap between the two of them?
Well, I think the virtual reality is a relatively straightforward concept to start off with, which is that you are, and excuse the obvious statement here, but you're in a virtual reality. So,
Mhm.
so it's something that is a virtual world that's digital and it looks digital. Now, that doesn't have to be with VR headsets. That doesn't have to be the big clunky headphones that you put headsets that you put on. Normally, that is what you would see. Virtual reality is about seeing a virtual world. Just for sort of completeness, in case it's helpful, augmented reality is really where you see that virtual world and the real world together. So it's much more about overlaying information on the real world. Virtual reality is about a separate world. The metaverse becomes much more complicated than that, I think, where it's about people interacting on there. So it's no
Mhm.
longer do you go into a closed environment, which is a virtual world that you can download on your app for free and get these amazing experiences. But it's about where you start interacting with people and being much more engaged with living in that world. And because you're living in that world, there's an opportunity to create content, to own it. It becomes much more decentralized. So I think virtual reality is just a relatively straightforward in terms of content and how it's delivered, probably pretty complex. But in terms of a concept, it's just a virtual world that you put yourself in through a screen or through something else. And the metaverse is much more about moving the world that you live and breathe in into that virtual space where you interact with people and you can exchange, you can buy and sell and do whatever.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. That might sound obvious to others, but I didn't have a full appreciation of the differences between that. So I appreciate you breaking that down. And I guess
I
to
think it's
your
worth saying that, and I mean, again, this might be the wrong thing to say, but I do think some people get overly caught up on the definitions of some of these things. I think, from my point of view, at least, and I'm sure you can find some better definitions of all of those things that are out there. But I think that the important thing here is we're moving towards, or there is going to be more of a digital world for people to engage with. Will they engage with it? Do they want to engage with it? Well, some yes and some no. And I think that a lot of the reasons why people turn around today and go, just not for me, it's not going to work, they're problems that will be resolved pretty quickly. I mean, we can be relatively confident about predicting that the processing power, the cost is going to go up, cost of technology is going to go down, more data is available on everything. There are certain trends which are going to be around. So if we think that it's too expensive and it's too clunky today to go and have a good experience, that's probably true. I find it quite a clunky experience. But in 5 years, it's going to be better. In 10 years, it's going to be even better. In 20 years, it'll be even better. And the question then becomes, at what point do I feel comfortable going in that I don't feel a bit seasick from virtual reality headsets, and I don't have my eyes hurting, and I don't think talking to a few blocky characters is entertaining. So it then becomes a question over time rather than the answer itself.
Yeah, and there was a comment that came in from Ron Rody, who mentioned that as well, saying that Metaverse needs some better VR. Which is, for anybody that's yeah, thanks for the comment, Ron. Anybody that's used those goggles, at least in the some of the ones that exist now, and I haven't worn any in a while to know what the technology's caught up to. But it is clunky, and it's not necessarily a great user experience. But I agree, just the nature of the way technology goes is it will get to that level. And I think that that's why Facebook changing their name to Meta, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well. Is Facebook already acknowledging that we're already in this digital world where you can connect with people, you can buy and sell on marketplace within that world? Is that what Facebook, now Meta, is that what they're going towards? And I guess two-part question for that: where do you see Facebook trying to get to?
Oh wow, great question. So I say this as a non-Facebook user.
You're one of the smart
For
ones.
so so I guess if you look at the majority of people today, so a lot of small businesses, most people, they will be on Facebook and engaged there. That is where a huge amount of engagement happens. So the exception to when people, at least in the Western world, are using Facebook is they decide not to use Facebook and go onto WhatsApp, which is, guess what, owned by Facebook or Meta. Sorry. And I think that they're looking at the natural progression of where does that whole interaction go from a screen and a platform to a more interactive world. So I'm not going to second guess the Facebook strategy. They're much brighter than I am, but I think that there's a natural progression from there is a website which people go to and it really owns all of our data and content. Then they need to go into a more interactive version of that. That doesn't necessarily mean the virtual reality side of things, but I think that's the natural progression. And I think by hosting that and owning that space in inverted commas, then they can take a big step forward. I guess there are a couple of questions that follow on from that. One is, which I suppose is me being a little bit cheeky, but I do wonder whether rebranding as Meta means that the definition or the term metaverse is slightly less likely to get mainstream traction.
Hmm.
So a lot of people, most people use Facebook, at least in the Western world. But there is also a lot of concerns about data, how it's used. They've got some pretty high profile challenges in the past. And so, at what point do you go from wanting to have all of your information online that you can use, but at least you can turn your laptop and your computer off and your phone off, to then being in this place where literally everything in terms of engaging happens? I'm not suggesting that this is where people spend 24 hours a day plugged in like the Matrix, but it's also going to be something that people spend more and more time in and interact more and more. At what point do people say, actually, this feels a little bit uncomfortable? And so I do wonder whether the metaverse as a concept is something that's going to happen and grow and continue. I do wonder a little bit whether the term itself is going to become a little bit, it won't last as long as the technology itself, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's that to ask, and it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out. As you were mentioning that, a thought just occurred to me too about applications of this, not even in the business context. And I do specifically want to ask you how this will relate to the real estate industry, but even for those skeptical that they'll be wearing VR headsets, it's how much different is it from looking at a TV screen or looking at a computer screen if that technology improves to the level that you don't even notice that you're wearing a VR set. But perhaps if you're watching a sports game, football, I'm sure is a lot more popular in your neck of the woods than ours. But let's just say soccer as an example. If you wanted to watch a soccer game on TV, or if you could wear a VR headset where you could actually be immersed in the game, and you turn your head and you could be looking at the stands, or you could be looking at it in 3D, the experience offers so much of an opportunity to increase versus just looking at a flat two-dimensional TV. So the more that you're talking about these potential applications, the more I just see that, yeah, I can see myself wearing a VR headset down the road.
Yeah, well, I think that's a perfect example. I'm going to call it football rather than soccer, but
Sorry, that's probably blasphemous how I said it.
No, not at all. So actually, you can do that already. So over here, BT Sports a few years ago brought out pitch side cameras which had 360 views. So you could see, it was a 360 camera. You could put on a virtual reality headset and watch TV by looking around in 360. Now the problem was the headsets aren't that great. It was by the side of the pitch, so what you could watch is the manager brilliantly, so you could see what he was doing, jumping up and down, but you couldn't see much of the game. And so there are some real limitations with that. But you can see that the theory is there already, and there is no doubt that headsets are going to become lighter, they're going to become cheaper, they're going to become better quality. There was a story recently about people are starting to bring out contact lenses. Now, a long time, I think, before we're using contact lenses that give us this perfect everything. And they're probably more likely to be used for things like augmented reality, which is putting stuff in front of your eyes in the real world. But that is the direction that we're going. And I think the debate is that in 20 years, or is that in 50 years, or is that in 100 years? However far you want to take it, I would argue that technology tends to move a lot quicker than we give it credit. There's a great quote by Bill Gates, which is that we always overestimate the amount of change, technology change in 2 years, and underestimate the amount that will happen in 10 years. And that feels about right to me. I think if you and I have this conversation in 2 years, we'll have moved on for sure. It won't be a completely different world. I think in 10 years, then we might be doing this through VR headsets, for example. So we won't be looking at a flat screen. And our kids will be coming in saying, why did you use this weird flat screen thing when you could just put on a pair of glasses and be in a different world?
It might be almost as stark of a contrast between color TVs and black and white TVs, where it just seems so crazy that that long ago is only black and white. While it might be that crazy in 10 years, like you said, that the difference. And I think that as we start exploring that, I think, and like myself, and I'm hopeful that people listening can think of this as well, is that there are obvious real estate applications for looking at how a space could look. So if you're into a warehouse, how your racking might go, or how the machinery might go, if you had a layout of what the warehouse looked like, you could use VR, perhaps even augmented reality, to really picture how that space would look, how much space you'll need. If it's an office space, you could start designing the furniture around it. That's, I'm assuming, the natural implementation of it right now. Is that the obvious one, or are there additional ways that this can actually start getting incorporated into the real estate space?
No, again, great question. So I think the virtual reality, augmented reality is all about visualization, quite advanced visualization, some of it just in its own isolation and some of it in the real world. So we need to think about that very much as visualization. I'll come back to that in a second. I think when we talk about Web 3.0, when we talk about Metaverse, it's much more about society, community, people, ownership of content in that space and having value. That content has value. So if you go back to something like Facebook, we're all putting content on all the time and we give it away for free, and they then make a lot of money from it. Now that's fine. Most people understand what's going on. I'd argue there are some challenges about how educated people are about it. But in the future, we can start owning that content ourselves. And we can come back to that. That's very much more about the metaverse. So I think the virtual reality in the real estate world is about exactly what you just said. It's about giving people an experience to see what something can look like. Virtual reality is where you have a complete virtual world, and there are a number of companies who are creating great walkthroughs, ability to see things. I think COVID has been a great boost. Obviously, it's been a terrible time for all sorts of reasons, but it has been a great boost to driving the adoption of technology. At the stage where you couldn't go and look around houses, people had to find reasons and ways of doing that virtually. So I think those virtual reality models where you can walk around, have a look at things, whether it's a real place that you don't have to go to, or whether it's a virtual place that you're replicating to look at what it might look like, I think is absolutely spot on. I think augmented reality is also the same, but that's where you're in the place. So what you can do is there are a lot of office fit out companies, for example, starting to use augmented reality. So you walk into the actual space, but you can then start visualizing what it looks like. And actually visualizing what it looks like for a lot of people, especially in the creative side of things, is relatively easy. But for a lot of people, it's really hard to understand what it's going to look like. And so you can start really talking through what it's going to look like. And actually that doesn't work. You can move it and get some engagement. And I think another good example of augmented reality is in planning. So planning to get something designed is a real challenge. I don't know the Canadian system as well, but certainly in the UK, we have a really advanced system of posting paper notices up on lampposts to tell people what we're going to do. And we have all these really archaic drawings. And so the opportunity to take someone down to a site and say, right, this is an empty building at the moment, but we're going to knock it down. It's going to look like this. Allows you to really look at it and engage and have a look at how it impacts society, the buildings around it, the shadows. And so it's a really powerful tool to let people see what it's going to look like. And again, interpret it in a real world way that everyone understands, rather than having to be an expert architect taking 2D plans and understanding what that is in your head. So I think the augmented reality, virtual reality is incredibly valuable, and in real estate has got a lot of value. I think there's another step about augmented reality, which is actually how you operate and move around buildings. So we've seen the growth of workplace apps at the moment going up, and I'm again focusing on offices here, but they're applicable to all sectors. If you know where there's a meeting room, or if you've booked a desk, it can show you by map. It actually becomes much easier to start going if you have it pictured in front of you. You can see where people are, you can see the data that you want, and that feels really science fiction to me. But if you go into something like Google Maps, then they already do that. So in Google Maps, you can put up your phone in front of you, and it will, in augmented reality, it will show you where the street is. It'll put the maps, the arrows on the roads in the direction that you need to go. And so they have to restrict what they do because of safety, because they can't obviously have people walking all over the place. But already in Google Maps, every single person who's listening to this who has an Android phone has that on their phone already. You go into Google Maps, get directions, you can have it as augmented reality. And so I think the interaction of guiding around the building becomes much more interesting, where you can start seeing where you should be going. You can direct people to give them a better experience. You can also have a look at things like service engineers. So if you have a really good model of a building, then a service engineer can come in and see where everything is. So we talk about BIM models, for example. If you have a good and up-to-date BIM model, then you'll be able to see where all the wires are, all the cables, all the everything else. So if you have a cable that's gone, you know exactly where to go and look for it. You don't have to dig around and to change things, and you can see through your glasses. Now, the challenge with everything I've just said is that technology, is that, do you want to walk around with enormous glasses on your head? And the answer to most people is no. So again, I think before it becomes really engaging and really useful and seamless, then for it to be beyond a bit of a gimmick and be really seamless and useful, I think it has to be something that people are prepared to just put their phone up and look through, which is not that often, or it has to have the technology to be able to see it seamlessly, like the glasses or the contact lenses, which I think are a few years off.
Yeah, that was the question I was going to ask, is how long do you think that is off before it gets to from being at a level where it does seem like gimmicky? And I remember those Google Glass glasses that came out a few years ago, and nobody would want to wear those. But it should get to a level, I assume, at some point where it looks aesthetically fine and it doesn't look out of place. Do you think a few years, is that like a reasonable guess?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any great insights to how long, but based on the adoption curve, you're looking at a few years before they come out. So there are a lot of companies looking at glasses which are on the market now, which are smart glasses. They tend to be having audio, you can talk to them, they've got a camera, but it's that sort of imposing pictures on the front that's not really there yet, as far as I've seen. So I think we're probably a handful of years away before we get that, maybe 2 to 5. And then the other thing is the adoption rate. So we will maybe in 2 to 5 years see people walking around with glasses on who are saying it's amazing, but they'll be really expensive. They'll be the early adopters. They won't work that well. They'll be difficult. Before we get to mainstream, everyone's using it like a mobile phone or whatever it might be that we're used to. I think that would be a bit longer.
Getting back to the real estate side, I've heard the term tossed around recently about a property having a digital twin. What's the definition and the logic behind that? And what even is it? How would you describe that?
Yeah, sure. So that's another great question. So traditionally, we have data sets on buildings. Pick any industrial building you want. We'll know a little bit about it, the address perhaps, and how big it is. We'll have a data set somewhere, probably in an Excel sheet or a small database. We've got that data. We're moving into a world where we're having digital 3D models. So often BIM models, and you get different levels of granularity and quality. And that BIM model, or that 3D digital model, is a model of the building that replicates it perfectly. So obviously to a different level of granularity, but you can say, I can see this building, I can see where the elevator is, I can see where the pipes are, I can see where the HVAC system is, and if I go into the building, I can see exactly the same thing. And that's got enormous benefits because it speeds up significantly understanding where things are. You can very quickly find out. I mean, buildings are traditionally handed over with a paper folder, and then that's stored somewhere. You've now got everything at your fingertips to be able to do it. On top of that, you can start modeling what might happen in the building. So without making changes, you can start collecting the data, you can look at that analysis and understand where things are going. So that's a digital model that we've got of the building, and it's incredibly powerful. Where I think we move to the digital twin, and again, I think there are lots of different definitions, but the digital twin is where the digital model and the building are not only the same, but they're actually connected. So I can go into the digital twin and turn the heating up in a system. It will be reflected in the building itself. So where we are today is we've got data. We're moving towards having digital models. The digital twin is where we're going, where the building and the digital model are interactive and connected together. And I think that's the sort of progression that we're going on. I think before we've got digital twins for a lot of buildings is going to be a long time. It has to be that digital model, the connection, the sensors, the ability to control things. But absolutely, there are things that are being created to do that now. And I think that is where we're going to be going over time. So I think that there are real benefits to that in terms of efficiency, energy costs, meeting user needs. There are a lot of benefits. I think that where we're going to go to longer term is that the recognition that you can get higher rents, lower vacancies, lower penalties from sort of sustainability costs, all of those things are because of that digital model, or even more so the digital twin, and therefore they're going to be included within a building's capital value. So I think the valuation process today doesn't consider them. I think the valuation or appraisal process of tomorrow is going to start considering them. And I think for me, that's going to be the sea change where we see mass adoption, because whether people buy into it or not, whether they're looking long-term or short-term, putting the capital value up by having a digital model will be a worthwhile investment. The return on investment becomes much easier.
Yeah, and like we talked about earlier, even though some existing building owners might not see the value of having that tie-in where the twin actually interacts with the physical building, even though some existing owners might not see it, the next generation of property owners are going to be much more tied into this whole system, and they'll be the ones that really drive the demand for it. And if the demand is there, the supply has to catch up to meet it at some point. So I find that fascinating.
Well, I think we're sort of entering into this perfect storm or perfect opportunity, depending on your perspective. But absolutely, people are going to have to be working much harder to make their space feel engaging and attractive, and Getting people back into the office is going to be a real challenge, as an example. But for all building types, retail, industrial, residential, we're going to see that there's going to be a trend of people wanting more and more from their buildings. And to do that, we need to have the data and the technology to understand it and improve performance.
Hmm.
The other part of that storm is that leases and buying times and everything else are getting shorter and quicker. So the 25-year leases of several years ago are now down to 6 or 7 year leases. But the growth of co-working, where people are buying space for a month or 2 months or 3 months at a time, is everywhere now. And that's what a lot of people are looking at. They want flexibility. Arguably, an awful lot of people are just going to coffee shops. So they're paying not even for the space, they're paying for the coffee to allow the space to do it. So it's almost on a half hourly basis. So if your building doesn't attract the right people in history when you've got a 25-year lease, there's not a great deal that you can do about it. But at the same time as buildings need to attract people and work for them and companies much better, those companies and those people are much more able to do something about it, because they'll move next door because it's getting cheaper and easier and quicker.
Very interesting. We've covered a lot already, but if you have any questions on what we've covered, please feel free to add that in, and we'll answer any questions we can. I want to explore this decentral land a little bit more, and that article that I referenced earlier about the large brokerage being brought on to lease 120,000 square feet in this digital universe. So I guess I don't fully understand why there would be a need for it. And I love the point that you made about 400 million users on Fortnite, and they had an online concert that was really well attended. I understand that, and I can see that being very valuable. But where is there a need for digital retail space or a digital warehouse space or digital office? Where does that need come in?
Well, yeah. I mean, a great question again. So I think if you look at the virtual world generally, and let's just talk about any flavor of the virtual world we're talking about, it's the ability to be somewhere else or to get some extra information. It's an interface and interaction. If we go into the metaverse, it's about a little bit more than that. It's about creation and content and ownership of that valuable aspect. And so I think that in all of those examples, if you're not looking about, for example, investing in it to make money from it directly, if you're looking about retail or office or residential, it's where people go to interact and to experience things. So I might go to the mall down the road just to experience what it's like there. But actually, if I can go to a virtual one and I'm happy and comfortable doing that, why would I not want to do it for the same reason? So you go and meet people, you go and see what's there, you can see the different stores that are there, you can go do whatever you want. And as people are becoming more and more comfortable with online retail, if in an office environment, maybe you could go to somewhere and have a meeting with someone. So you're in some virtual space where you meet. I think the industrial space is a little bit different. I think the residential space is a little bit different, because residential, typically you don't want to be in a virtual house. You're more likely to want to be in your space. And industrial is about storing and creating things. So it's less likely that you're going to need to have that physical storage in a virtual world. So I think that it will affect different sectors in different ways. But I think that the need for something like retail is that experience of going and getting what you can without having to go out, without having to do anything, without having to leave your place. There are then extra experiences that you can add on top of that. So, for example, you can very quickly start trying on 100 different things in clothing if you wanted to get it delivered to your house quickly. And so, interestingly, as the virtual world for retail in particular, I think, gets more online, arguably there's going to be a movement towards needing more real industrial space. So far from replacing the physical industrial space that we have, I think it's going to become more important. And I think over the last, let's say, 10 years, certainly over the last 2 or 3, companies like Amazon have just taken amazing amounts of space around the world because everyone's now buying stuff online. Going into a virtual world allows you to do it in a better, more experiential, maybe buy slightly different things, like clothing is still not necessarily as bought as often as other items. But as you go into that space, then actually the industrial space is going to be needed more. So I think for me, there'll be some asset classes like hospitality, like retail, where there are going to be really good opportunities for people to go and experience those things in the metaverse or in the virtual world. I think some sectors like industrial, it's hard to see how industrial space in the metaverse is going to be a massive thing, because this is all about storing physical assets. But interestingly, that might have a knock-on effect for the industrial space longer term, as people need more and more real-world space to meet that virtual need. So I think that over time we're going to see a sort of shift. I'm a massive, unsurprisingly, fan of technology and the digital world, and I'm a big believer in it. But I'm also a massive believer in people and the real world space. So I think that the future is going to be a blend and a combination of all of that. And so I think that the companies who come out of this well are the ones who think about where we're going. Are we all going to, as a population, live in the metaverse? I don't think so. Are we all going to ignore it completely and never go on technology? Pretty sure that's not going to happen either. How do we build that future of what's possible? And I guess that goes back to the very first question. From an investor point of view, do you need to know about the metaverse? I would say yes. Not necessarily in detail about how it works, but at a high level, what is it? Why are people going there, even if you don't necessarily want to? And what are the implications of that for, let's say you invest in retail or you invest in industrial space? What are the impacts of that going forward?
That was a fascinating observation about how an increase in this virtual world, and I completely agree. I see that application on a retail front or a hospitality front, even on like an office front. Industrial might be a little difficult to, or at least I can't foresee any way that industrial can tie in directly into that virtual world. But the two clearly intersect, and I love that point that you made, that if virtual reality makes it, and this metaverse and the on virtual world, if it makes it easier for customers to go and try things, and the experience is that much better than just going on to Amazon and clicking on things in two-dimensional form, that could drive even more e-commerce sales, which will in turn necessitate even more warehouse space. So I think that has a very profound implication for the industrial real estate world going forward. More virtual, more e-commerce sales, however it gets there. But if the system's designed to get more e-commerce sales, it's going to lead to more warehouse demand.
It is, absolutely. And this is possibly slightly away from the metaverse specifically, but the interesting fact about that is, so I would say that the industrial space is going to go up for exactly the reasons you just said. The interesting implications then is, where does that industrial space need to be? Is it in the right place at the moment, or does it need to be elsewhere? And connected to that, what skills and resources of people need to work in those spaces? So we're seeing robots and automation and all sorts of things coming up the agenda. And again, this is going to take a long time. But if you go to some warehouses, they are becoming incredibly automated. But for those to be automated, you need incredible connectivity. You need a lot of power, which is not always possible. You need a different type of people. People still work in those buildings, but they're people to look after the machines rather than people to do the moving and shifting. And so the warehouses that we need are going to need to be in, or the growth in space, I think, is going to be there in warehouses. The question then becomes, where does it need to be to have the right, in 20 years, where does a warehouse need to be to have the right audience? What if we're getting down to, Amazon are constantly going from a couple of days delivery down to a day, down to 2 hours, down to an hour. But that needs that last mile stopping place. So are we going to see huge warehouses, or are we going to see lots of very, very small warehouses scattered about? And personally, I think a little bit of both. But whatever it is, the space itself is going to grow, but the investment side of things needs to be looking at what is that long-term trend, not necessarily of technology itself, but of the impact of technology on the real estate space. Because if you invest in the right space, you can make massive opportunities and have huge returns. If you invest in the wrong space, then I think that you could have the opposite.
And I suppose that's been a constant throughout history. You buy the wrong property in the wrong location, it can be a failure. If you buy the right, even if you buy an average property in the right market, it can be a huge success. So I'm sold on it. I love the idea of of wanting to actually learn more about this. What do you say to someone like myself who wants to learn more about this, and without getting granular about like getting into the weeds and like what you said about learning how to code and all that, but just where do you recommend to people that they can actually go to learn more about this topic?
Well, I think there are two or three different suggestions on that. So the first thing is that I think that frankly, a quick Google search comes up with some awesome videos that give you really good high-level explanations. I would recommend doing that. I think just thinking through the very basics on videos that are readily available on YouTube or wherever it might be, and then you can go through and think about, what does that mean for my job? What does it mean for my company? What does it mean for my customers? What does it mean for my buildings? And I think that understanding that is a really good starting point. I think the level of depth that most property professionals need to know could be learned very, very quickly. The challenging bit, and the good news is, this is where property professionals, if they're open-minded and engaged enough, are best placed to do it. The challenging bit that takes time is, what are the consequences of that? What does that mean? What do we do about it? The second thing is, I think that there are a lot of organizations out there that are traditional real estate organizations, professional bodies, who are starting to look into this and bring people in. So things like the professional bodies, things like this sort of podcast or the webinar is a perfect example of engaging with that to find out more and find out different points of views. I'm absolutely convinced that there is not going to be a consensus on where things are going, what the definitions mean. And so part of it is to hear different people talking about it in different ways and work out that actually there isn't always a yes or no or right or wrong answer. The third thing is, which we haven't really touched on, and I am conscious of time here, but behind everything that we've spoken about is data. And I think it's just worth touching on data generally as a general point. The real estate sector, the world, is going to become data driven. The phrase "data is the new oil" is an expression I really dislike. I don't think it's very helpful. But there is one thing about it that's true, and why it's come up is because the world that we're moving into is going to be data driven. Everything is going to be around data and data performance and understanding how we do it. That includes the metaverse, that includes digital models, that includes virtual reality, but that includes the real world decisions we make about where to buy, where to invest, how to use. Everything is going to be data driven. And as real estate experts, we have a real challenge, which is combining the culture in particular and the processes of the real estate world, which is low risk and it's slow and it's high capital investment. It's about being really, really steady, counter-cyclical. That's the culture of real estate, and that is the beauty of real estate. So absolutely not a criticism. If you look at technology, it's all about fast, fail fast, invest and then invest into the operations. So all sorts of different characteristics and cultures are out there. And the key for any company is to understand, firstly, the basics of data. Just like the metaverse, they don't need to understand, they don't have to be data scientists, but data is going to be behind everything that we do. And it's not just the spreadsheet that we've worked on for the last 20 years. This is about much more complicated data. So the data culture that we need to embrace and combine with the real estate cultures, and the companies of the future, the buildings of the future, and the people of the future who are successful in the real estate sector will be the people who can combine those two things and bring them together. Every company will be having to bring those together. Doesn't mean one person needs to do everything, but every company of the future will need to bring those together. So data culture, data skills, data governance, and the real estate skills, creativity, the human interaction, those two things coming together is going to be absolutely critical. And that does go into all sorts of topics that are probably not worth touching on right now, but things like data governance, data ethics, the risk of digital buildings. There are a lot of topics that people need to get engaged with. So if there's one message above everything else, I would hope that people can take away is, there is a really, really exciting opportunity for buildings, for the property industry, for anyone working in it, traditional, new. We've got a long way to go, but the successful people will be those who engage and embrace and don't bury their head in the sand. So by definition, the people listening to this will be engaging with technology to some degree, but I would urge people to really, really to carry on and engage. They don't need to be data scientists or coders, but the future will be data and technology driven to a degree.
Well, I'm inspired. That's such a great message. I love how eloquently you sum that up on that. And Beverly has been putting some of your contact information in there. We've got link to Alpha Property Insight. We also have a link to your LinkedIn in there, and I encourage people to reach out to you. I guess with the last couple minutes we have remaining, tell me a little bit more about Alpha Property Insight. I we're connected on Twitter, but I admittedly don't know nearly as much about your company as I'd like to. So if you could use a couple minutes to just share with people more about Alpha Property Insights.
Yeah, that's really kind. So Alpha Property Insight is a consultancy. It's a small consultancy that helps. It tends to help. So it's all about digitalization of the real estate sector, and it tends to work with senior leaders in the real estate side of things, or government and industry bodies, to really think through what is going to happen in the future, what to do about it, and really hold their hand through that journey. So a lot of real estate companies are amazing at real estate. Obviously, a lot of real estate professionals are amazing at real estate. A lot of technology professionals are amazing at technology, but bringing those things together and trying to debunk and demystify some of the things that are out there is often the way of doing it. So it's about developing strategies. So we help companies to develop strategies to benefit from the digital changes. One other thing just to mention as well is a separate organization I'm involved with called the Real Estate Data Foundation, which is a not-for-profit initiative around data. So it's a really good place to go and have a look at some of the starting points of learning about data. That's about connecting conversations and standards and so on around the data side of things. And it's also about raising data ethics up the agenda. The ethical use of data, I think, is going to be one of the biggest factors that we come across in the next 10 to 20 years. But those 10 to 20 years are going to be dependent on the things that we do now. As a sector, we aren't always as liked as I think we should be. We are seen quite negatively. And there's a huge opportunity for us as buildings go from dumb concrete blocks to tomorrow's digital platforms. There's a huge opportunity for us to take responsibility for that and to not get stuck into some of the challenges that companies like Meta and like other companies have got in the technology world. So our responsibility as owners, operators, and managers of buildings is going to become much more about how do we manage data, the digital model, the digital twin, and taking that and getting on the front foot with it is going to be really important. There's a saying, according to IBM, that 90% of the world's data that was ever created in the totality of history was created in the last 2 years alone. And if that's true, and if that's a trend that's going to continue, then this is not a problem that's about to get smaller. So getting to grips with data is going to be a challenge. It's difficult, but getting to grips with it in 2 or 5 or 10 years is going to be a much bigger challenge. So I would urge people to really engage and start looking at that from a data point of view and digital strategy point of view.
Well, I'm going to reach out to you again at some point here in the near future to see if you'd be interested in coming on again for a couple of reasons. I'd love to explore data in more detail, and I'd also just like to see how far things have come. So when we do the second interview, if you're up for it, I'll go back and watch this interview to see like what we predicted in timeline, and then we'll see how close things are coming or whether it's changed or went in a different direction altogether. So if you're up for it, I'd love to have you on a show down the road as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, those were outstanding answers you gave. You put a lot of thought into those. You're exceptionally well spoken. I really do appreciate the time. Encourage people to connect with you or reach out to you for your website. And for anyone watching, if you like this, please give us a thumbs up. Right on cue, Wyatt, giving us a thumbs up emoji on there. And if you're watching this after or listening to it, I love comments. So let me know if you got any value from this or have any questions. And if there's something that I can't answer, I'll reach out to Dan and see if he can help out as well. But thanks everyone for tuning in, and catch